Hello, everyone. As you're filtering in, we're excited to have you with us here. I'm Tim Corpus. I'm the executive director for the Ear Taxi Festival, which, if you're not familiar, is a program of New Music Chicago. And this is the largest contemporary classical music festival in Chicago. And we're so excited to be presenting concerts throughout the month of October. And we also are very excited about these special professional development events like today's webinar. And we're very excited and honored to have Odell Mitchell with us and the Lawyers for the Creative Arts for helping support this festival. Odell, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, gladly. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is going to be great. So, folks, if you have questions, be sure to put those in the Q&A. You can say hi in the chat. And then also, there are a lot more performances coming up for the festival. So be sure to go on to eartaxifestival.com and get your to those upcoming events. So with that, Odell, I'll hand it off to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. It's good to have you all. So, like Tim said, I'm Odell Mitchell III with Lawyers for the Creative Arts and here to talk to you a bit about demystifying entertainment industry contracts. So, kind of across the board. Now, a few things about this. So, first of all, this is meant to be somewhat interactive in the sense that whoever is here, there's a couple of times where I'll toss out a few questions and like polls and things like that where you can interact if you want. And then, very much like Tim said, if you have questions or anything like that, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A or even pop anything into the chat, and we'll try to make sure that there is some time toward the end to get to chat about some of these things. Now, a little bit about me, just so you know, is I'm an entertainment attorney. So this is the work that I do in this space and have for about a decade now. My goodness. So based largely in Chicago, but then also with clients kind of all around and your what you would consider your entertainment hubs, your LAs, your Nashvilles, your Atlantas, etc. And I've always done entertainment work because I come to this as a fan. I love this stuff. And I find it to be just so incredibly important. I think the world turns better when people are making good things and putting them into the world. But part of that is that when you're doing that, and if you are either directly involved in that or involved in a supportive capacity or whatever the case may be, there are certainly challenges, pitfalls, everything that can come up. And so, and one of the things that is important to me and important to us at Lawyers for the Creative Arts is to make sure that people are able to focus on the things that they want to do, focus on the things that they want to create, and also have an understanding of the legal and business impacts so that it doesn't slow those things down, but rather moves them forward. So, as we're looking at what we're talking about today, we'll have an opportunity to just look at a handful of different aspects of just entertainment industry contracts. So a few things around it. So for one, you could just spend so much time swimming through this. There's so much that you could swim in and drown in, etc. So we won't go as deep as possible, but we'll certainly do our best to swim through it in a way where we feel like we get the full wash over us. And so here's a bit of a breakdown of some of the things that we'll look at. So during our time here, we'll look at a few things. So first of all, we'll talk about some key terms and provisions that tend to come up in contracts. And so what are some of the common things that you might see? What are some of the common ways they might sound? What are some of the typical implications of those things so that you can feel empowered even looking at something? I mean, always you want someone like myself looking through some of the more challenging things, but nevertheless, I certainly wouldn't want it to be where someone is looking at a contract and it's immediately just daunting to them. So understanding some of our key terms and provisions will help break that into pieces and unlock some of the mystery. Then we'll also talk a bit about fees and compensation, like how does the money flow? And it's wonderful to do great work and put good things in the world, but also it's great to be compensated for it properly. It's a key and important part. I mean, I know we're all trying to eat, so we'll look at some of the ways in which that comes about. And then I'll also just talk to you about some of the common contracts that come up in the entertainment industry. So not just across music, but across other places, because there are some interlocking pieces and in our ever-changing, ever kind of, I'd say, enmeshed entertainment landscape, looking at things from different angles might touch different pieces. So seeing where some of that comes up for sure. And then, of course, lastly, if there's any Q&A or any questions that come up, I certainly want to give us some time to talk through some of those. So these will be some of the things that we take a look at as we step into it. So the first thing that we'll do, like I mentioned, is we'll talk about some key terms and provisions. So get an understanding of what are some of the standard things that you tend to find in a contract. Now, the thing that I'll do is I do have a question for you when it comes to this. So I'm going to switch this over here because this will be an opportunity to chime in if you would like to. So what you'll see here is this is an opportunity if you're using your phone, your device, anything of the sort. You can either hit the QR code or go to menti.com and enter in the code here, and this will bring up the code for our session. So if you are on and you're able to, please feel free to join in. I see a couple of people joining, which is great because then, as we ask some of our questions, we'll actually get some results here. So again, you see this here on screen. This is an opportunity for you to join. We just have a couple of questions that we'll use throughout that give us a chance to get a little bit of feedback. So I'll bring this up again whenever the time comes. But really, the first question that I have is this. So how do you feel about your ability to read and understand a contract? Like whenever something comes across you, how do you feel about your ability to read and understand a contract? This is great. I see some of our answers coming through. Excellent, excellent. Okay. It's across the spectrum, which is nice. Okay, okay, this is good. Yeah, that's great. So I like this because honestly, there are different ways that we might look at. For some of us, we might go, you know what? Those words on screen are a bit much, and I don't feel so great about having to interact with them. That's totally understandable. Some comfort, some worry. I think that's really natural. And then some of us, like myself included, are like, oh my gosh, give me these words. I love the smell of boilerplate in the morning. That's totally fine. So no matter where you fall, whether it's, on one end of the spectrum or on another or somewhere in between, there are things here for you. So you might find that as we talk about key terms and provisions where you're like, oh yeah, like I know about those things and it feels good to feel some validation or some refreshment around them. Or you might find that you're like, I've never heard of it that way or thought of it that way. Either way, that's perfectly fine. So wherever you fall, that's really, really great. So like I said, let's hop into some of our key terms and provisions that tend to come up in a and your kind of like standard contracts here. So the few things that we'll look at is our term, like the actual term, and then also services, and then grant of rights, fees and compensation, and kind of how it shows up in an agreement oftentimes, and then also termination. These are some of our standard pieces. Now, if you've looked at a contract, whether you've been comfortable with one or you've run into challenges with one, you know that this is not it. This is not the sum total of what is typically found in a contract. But like I said, key terms and provisions. So the idea here being that if you're looking at any agreement, then you should at least know what these things are, what they entail, what you're getting into when it comes to these pieces. If you've got a good sense of this understanding and you've got a good handle on these pieces, you'll have a really good understanding of what is this agreement about? What is going on in this contract? Even if there's a lot of other ancillary pieces in there, you'll know what you're getting into when you have these understandings. So one thing about these is that these are really kind of our sections that we'll look at, but you find that even though there are some industry practices and some kind of common themes that tend to come up, it doesn't always look exactly this way. So let's hop into our first one that we have here. The first one that we're talking about is term. So we talk about key terms and provisions, but when we're talking about term within a contract, essentially what we're talking about is how long does this last? How long is this for? So what you see on screen here is an example of what this might look like an agreement. This is like a management agreement where we see this here. So the overall idea when we're talking about the term of a contract is how long this lasts. What is the period that this is going on for? Now, a couple of things about this. In a contract, sometimes it will say the word term, and you'll be like, great, this is what this is. This is this section here. It's wonderful when that happens. And then all right, this is talking about how long this here. This is a defined term in this way. Oh, a defined term, defining the term of the agreement. So, sure. Now, that's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes it might look a different way. So, you really are looking for a section in the contract that talks about how long this is. Oftentimes, it's near the top. Sometimes it's further down. It needs to be in there somewhere because how long am I getting into this? And so it could have term can often be measured in a term of years, if you will. So, for example, a very simple standard contract might be for a year. Maybe that's the how long the term is. You think about your gym contract or something along those lines. It's a year long, or it might be shorter than that. Maybe it's monthly. If we think about a lot of our monthly services that, our streaming services that we have, like there's technically a monthly term. So you're paying for 1 month at a time. So it can be something along those lines. Now, in most entertainment spaces, you're typically going to find a longer term if it's measured in a term of time than like a month. So usually it's going to be something longer than that. So a year or 2 years or something along those lines. So that's kind of a standard way that you might see some of those simple pieces. So that's our first overall thing that we think about is, okay, well, how long does it last? Now, when we're thinking about term, it would be nice if it was just as simple as that. But as you might even see somewhat on screen here, usually in the term are some more complexities that tend to show up to help us really understand what is the life of this agreement as far as how involved I am in it. So, sure, how long does this last? What is this? Is this a 1 year term? 2 year term? How does that work out? But then also, what happens when it's done? And so, does this auto renew? Or does it, once it's done, it's done? Is this for a certain amount of time, or is it until a certain project is done? Is it for a certain run of shows? Is it for a certain amount of sessions? Like, what is that breakdown there? Are there going to be additional sessions afterward where it's really for, a specific amount of sessions, but then there might be 2 or 3 pickup sessions within a certain amount of time afterwards? Like, all of that stuff really might fall into the term, and that gives you a good sense of how long am I obligated to this as far as the performance and the services I have to provide. So understanding those pieces can be pretty complex. So when we talk about like a kind of agreement later on, we'll see that this can get really complicated depending on what kind of service is being performed and like how long it is and things along those lines. But in general, as far as key terms and provisions, term, what you're looking for is how long is this? Does it auto renew or does it cancel? And then also sometimes here in the term section or also in the termination or in both sections, it will tell you, what needs to be done to end it. So for example, this might be an agreement that lasts for a year, 1 year at a time, and then it automatically renews, unless, like we see kind of in this example here, one of the parties notifies the other that, hey, I don't want to keep this going. And then there might be specific instructions around when you can do that. And so this lasts for a year and you can get out of it after a year as long as you notify 30 days before that year is up, etc. So very standard stuff, and it's kind of similar to what some people might experience with other things that are not entertainment, a lease agreement or something along those lines. So you certainly want to know this. How long am I in this for? Okay, that's our first term. It's just using a lot of term. So that's our first term, talking about the term. Now, the next key provision that we tend to look at is really this notion of our services. So, what are the services being provided? Basically, what are you doing? What is being exchanged here in this sense? This is, of course, really important because we want to know how long the agreement is for, but also, like, what are we doing here? And so this should lay out pretty clearly what is the exchange between both parties or all the parties involved here. Because of that, it can be small, it can be long. Like sometimes this might be a really significant part of the agreement. If the service is that there's going to be, 3 social media postings on someone's channel, maybe that won't be quite as long. But if the service is for like main talent in a movie or a feature film, then the service section might be pretty significant because there's a lot of specifics that get broken down there. Or if someone's doing, set design, maybe that's going to be rather particular. Or if someone is going to be doing multiple pieces that they're performing on something. So maybe what are the rehearsals that are involved, and then what's the actual performance involved, and is there any afterwork that's happening there? So those pieces might show up in the services. So we want to know what is being exchanged, what is the expectation between the parties of who is doing what, and laying that out as clearly as possible. so that we have a real kind of understanding of what's happening here. So sometimes it'll say services, but oftentimes it doesn't just say services because it's going to be typically more tailored to the actual environment or industry. And so we see here again from that same management contract, it says services, but we don't often talk about it just as services. So you're looking for a section in the contract that talks about who is doing what during the term of this agreement. So services is a key section that's particularly important. And again, it's going to help break down. Sometimes connected to this is where we'll automatically see some connection to what the fees are or things along those lines. But usually it's nice to have the services broken out pretty clearly. And then we talk about compensation a bit later. So like I said, this could be, a spot here where we see what's happening here. So term, our services, those are some key pieces that we're looking for. Now, the next thing, one of our next key provisions that we tend to be looking for is our grant of rights. So, especially in entertainment, this is particularly key where this shows up because in some places where people might be entering into a contract, the services and the grant of rights are kind of, I wouldn't say smashed together, but they're somewhat connected. But that may not necessarily be the case here. The grant of rights might be rather significant compared to what the services are, or vice versa. So the grant of rights is really, okay, what rights are being given, what rights are being withheld, what rights are being received, exchanged, etc. So we can see kind of in here in this example, someone would be giving up a significant amount of rights. This is an example of what it looks like when someone's doing kind of a simple work for hire here. So that means that the services they provide, they might be providing some sort of creativity, maybe writing a song, maybe creating a piece of visual art, whatever the case may be. And then the grant of rights is that they are turning over all the rights to that work in return for compensation. So they are shifting the rights to the contracting party to make it as though that contracting party was the author, at least has the rights of authorship in that regard. And so that's a significant exchange of rights. But even in that, sometimes there might be rights that are being withheld. So it might be something along the lines of a license rather than saying, hey, I have created this, and now I have created this, and I'm going to be transferring all of my rights over so that you can do whatever you want with it moving forward, and I'm getting compensated for that. Maybe that's one way, or maybe it's more of a license to say, okay, I'm not giving you the right to do it forever. For a certain amount of time, you can do these things, but I still have the ownership of it. And so those rights are going to come back to me at a certain point or under certain conditions or something along those lines. So maybe some of the rights are being withheld and it's more of a license. Maybe the rights that are given are exclusive. This contracting party, I'm writing this song, and only you can use it. Or maybe they're not exclusive. I'm writing this song, or I have this song, and I am going to sync it to some movie, but it also could be synced in other commercials or something along those lines. So you have these rights, but they are not exclusive. They are non-exclusive to someone else. These are some of the things you might see when we're talking about the exchange or grant of rights when it comes to it. And again, I find it to be particularly important in many of the aspects of creativity because when it comes to creating something, like that's a significant right that people have. Like the work of authorship in our laws is a pretty fundamental right, so to speak. Copyright work or the copyright of and like the work of authorship. These are pieces that are held with folks pretty significantly. So as soon as you create something, and it becomes, as we like to call, fixed and tangible medium, so it becomes something that is not just in our heads, then you have a real right there to hold on to that and to do lots of different things with it, exploit it, display it publicly, etc. And so this grant of rights might be something that you're shifting over significantly or in part or for a certain amount of time, etc. So you definitely want to see what rights are being given up, what rights are being withheld, because that has a direct impact on how much you should be compensated, or how much you should be compensating or asking for, etc., in that regard. So this is another piece that we see, that grant of rights, that exchange that happens there. Now, a couple more key provisions that we're looking for. Again, reminder, grant of rights usually does not say grant of rights. So it's maybe a section or a couple of sections that really start to talk about that exchange there. Now, a few more that are important here. Of course, fees and compensation. Now, you've seen this kind of coming up, or as I've been talking about it, the idea of being like, what is the rate of pay? So we know how long this thing is. We know, what the services that are going to be provided, what is the level of grant of rights or withholding of rights, like what's that exchange there? Those are some of the significant things that should impact what's the exchange of money here. Now, again, the way that this looks in an agreement, sometimes it might say fee or it might say compensation. Great, because it might be something pretty straightforward. Or it might be something much more complicated, depending on what the industry norms or standards are. So, maybe a commission or a royalty or a percentage or something along those lines. So there's various ways in which you might see this, but it should certainly clearly be laid out. So first of all, I mean, you decide what's important to you, but I am a big proponent that creative work has a significant amount of value. So there should definitely be some sort of exchange of some sort of valued exchange. Typically, people should be paid for their work in a clear and significant way for the things that are being put forth. And so that is one of the ways that we highly value and continue to value creative work. And so you should see that clearly laid out here. And again, this might break this down a few different ways. There might be a clear sense of like one way this is getting paid. It might be happening in stages, in different pieces. So there's different ways this might be outlined, but you should be looking for some section in the agreement that talks about, okay, how is the flow of money happening between folks here? And we'll talk a little bit about like what are some of the kinds of compensation that we tend to see across the entertainment industry. One other thing that we look for that sometimes gets missed over here when we're looking at key terms and provisions is termination. So the first piece that we talked about was term. We were talking about how long is this? Like how long does this agreement last? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 2 years and then it turns into one, or whatever the case may be? What's that breakdown of terminate or of term? But another piece that is sometimes connected right to the term, it might show up there, but definitely needs to be there somewhere, is termination. Basically, how do we end this agreement other than through satisfaction? If things don't work out the way that either of us or both of us wants to, what is the way to get out of this? What does this look like? Now, I will tell you now that this to me is one of the most important aspects of a contract that is oftentimes either missed or not fleshed out. And it makes practical sense why that happens. We agree to do something, we're excited about this, we're moving forward to it, like we're moving toward what this is going to look like. And we want that energy of creation and putting something in the world. We're not necessarily automatically thinking, and what if we both don't necessarily like it? And so sometimes this is either not there or it is not very well laid out. But I would say that a lot of times this is where the real challenge comes in. This is where I get pulled in a lot, is when this has not been considered or not well thought out. This is where a lot of the headaches come in, is when one or both parties say, you know what, I don't really like how this is going. Or even if they say, look, this went fine, but I would like to end this. And the other person's like, well, I don't necessarily want to end it. Or even if they say, this went fine, we both agree that we should end this, we don't necessarily agree how we should end it. Those are all things that can be wrapped up in the termination. And so, what does it look like to end this agreement other than through satisfaction? Now, this isn't always an equal setup. This is one of the places where oftentimes the power differential between the contracting parties is laid bare. So, if you are an individual and you are contracting with a larger organization, a lot of times their ability to terminate is going to be stronger than yours. They might have something kind of like what you might see here. They can terminate the agreement basically for any reason, at any time. But you may not be able to terminate it. It might be under specific, conditions, or specific conditions have to be met, and there has to be a certain time frame or something along those lines. So it may not be equally weighted, and that is sometimes the decision that you have to make in that. But certainly wanting to make sure that that is laid out there. Also, there are typically instructions around what has to happen in order to do the termination. So I'm gonna tell you right now, it's not generally okay to just like ghost on a contract. Just go in like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I'm just gonna stop responding to this. I'm just gonna stop doing what I need to do. I'm just gonna like absolutely not typically, unless that is somehow laid out in the contract, which would definitely not be one that I wrote if that was in there, then that is typically not acceptable to just stop performing on the contract. Closure is an important thing. And so oftentimes having it laid out in here, what does it look like to initiate those termination proceedings can help. Even when it's laid out in a really specific way, it doesn't always happen. It's kind of a breakup, so it doesn't always, happen the way that it's particularly laid out, but it's so much easier when there's clarity. You see some of that here, like even in this, it's like you have to give written notice, and usually there's a notice period. So how long before you have to give that notice, and then it comes into play. And then sometimes it depends on why this is happening. Maybe it can be for cause, or maybe it can be at will, or anything along those lines. And so this termination piece, I think, is particularly important. And honestly, again, even if everything has been satisfied and it's gone well, but there's not a clear end to it, especially with the way that the term, how long this is supposed to be, is laid out, it's great to have some clear sense here. So I find that this having a good termination can oftentimes make a contract feel less heavy, and especially once we get into it and things are moving along, you don't want this hanging over you as a cloud. And so to be able to, again, be focused on putting in the world the things that are important, the creative pieces. You want to be able to have this laid out in a great way. So, termination. How do you end an agreement other than through satisfaction? That should be laid out in there. This is one that often does say termination in there. But if it doesn't, you're still looking for a lot of this language around it, and helps us understand how do we end this. So those are some of the key provisions, key terms and provisions that we've seen so far. Things you're definitely looking for when it comes to it. Basically, how long is this? So our term, what are the services being provided? What are the things being done by both of the parties? What's the grant of rights? So, how much of the right is being given up or withheld in line with these services? Who's being paid what? How's the money flowing? And then also, how do we end this if it's not just through satisfaction? Even if we're both happy about it, still, how do we end it if there's not a clear end to it? Termination. So those are some of the key pieces that tend to show up. But there's also some other stuff that comes in here. I mean, you saw, some of us love the good old boilerplate. Now, boilerplate, when people talk about this is really like a lot of the standard provisions that are found in most contracts of a similar nature. A lot of times it's like the stuff that you just see, like it makes your eyes cross if you're not used to looking at it a lot. It's important though. These things are very much important. So um, we won't go through all of them because, again, sometimes they're just like snoozers for folks, but they are things that oftentimes they're considerations that need to go in each contract that are oftentimes kind of like asked and answered. Some of them are controlled by whatever the jurisdiction is and the typical laws there. Some of them are now basic industry practices that have been kind of codified into the contracts that you'd see. And so a lot of times you'll see some of them there. Some that I think show up often in a lot of contracts, but show up pretty often in entertainment contracts that you'd see are usually toward the end, but they're ones that you tend to see. So, for example, like accounting clauses. You don't always see that in other kinds of contracts, but in entertainment, it's not at all uncommon. Basically, okay, if there's some sort of revenue that's happening that's kind of ongoing, what does it mean to be able to account for that? Who has the ability to basically say, hey, I want to look at your books. I want to be able to see that this is accurate. What do all of those pieces look like to be able to do so? It's a really powerful and important piece. One entity should not always be open to having that happen to them at any point. And then also, that shouldn't always be closed off to the other. And so, what does it look like to be able to hop in and understand accounting if need be? Also, things like capacity clause, the realities of people having the capacity to enter into a contract. Is this person of legal age to do so? Do they have the right level of capacity? So, are they able to actually enter into a contract legally? Some things have been really great have maybe been undone or run into challenges because some of the folks who create some of the best work are underage, or some of the people who have some of the greatest legacies are in twilight times where their capacity to enter into agreement may not be clear. And so being able to see those pieces really matter. Jurisdiction clauses, like what state or jurisdiction controls this agreement. It feels like a small thing sometimes, but especially in entertainment, and this is true in general, but especially in entertainment, some places have more case law and more practices around it. So, for instance, you're going to have pretty robust understanding if your jurisdiction is California, and also pretty limited depending on which side of the contract you're on, as opposed to maybe a place where there aren't as many entertainment contracts or there's not as large of an industry in there. So just understanding the jurisdiction is particularly key. Another piece, and you usually see this, is just the entire agreement clause, really basically saying like everything that we have talked about, like this deal, this agreement, this contract is contained inside of this agreement. That seems so straightforward, right? Like it's only what is in writing. But I think in this day and age, it's really important to note that and know that, because a lot of things happen in DMs and then texts and then emails. And like we talked about this and we agreed that and we were saying this and we were saying that. Like that stuff is external to the contract once things are agreed upon. And so oftentimes you'll see that the contract says, well, everything that like all of the pieces of the contract are only what is inside here. So depending on where you are, maybe you're talking to some label rep or something like that, and they're saying we're going to do this and this and this, and then here comes the agreement. It doesn't necessarily represent clearly what you agreed upon, but you cannot just easily say, well, yeah, but the text message that we had, or this is what we talked about, or something along those lines. Once there's an entire agreement piece there, you want to make sure that it's all contained. And so that's one of the reasons it can take a long time, but that's also one of the pieces that really reasons it really matters. So these are some of the standard things that you tend to find in really kind of any contract, especially across, the land of contracting. But they do have an impact on things, especially after the fact. When things get messy, the clearer the boilerplate, the more tidy things are. So it's not adding words just to add things up. It's not bloatware in a contract, but those things do matter in a lot of ways. And so when you see them, don't just slice them out because you don't understand them, and don't just go along with them because you don't understand them. Like understanding those pieces is particularly key. Okay, so those are some of our key terms and provisions. It's a lot, but some of those, like I said, you can find that any one of those might be small or significant inside of a contract, depending on what you're looking at. But they are some of the tent pegs upon which the understanding and the importance is built around these pieces. So, key terms and provisions, knowing what those are key. Let's take a look at a couple of other things. So one of the other things that comes up here is this notion of fees and compensation. Again, people aren't typically doing this for free. So I'm going to switch us back over here I've got one more question for you. I'm curious what you think. So I'll move this over here. And if you have just joined us or you're still with us or you haven't, either way, you can come if you want to answer our question that we have here of what are some common kinds of compensation? If you need to, you would just join. You could use menti.com, tap in the code here. That will bring us in here. And that brings in some pieces. So, yep, I can see some coming across. That's great. That's great. Yep. Yeah, so good. We got flat fees, hourly fees, commission fees. I'm glad no one's picking the last piece there because that is not a valid form of compensation. Which, by the way, you can probably tell, right? Like these are the jokes, folks. Like it's all dad shtick. So hope that that's been okay for you because it doesn't get any funnier than this and it stays just as corny as this for the next 20-ish minutes. So I'm sorry, you're welcome. You decide whichever one it is. But yes, so yeah, you've got it right. We've got a handful of kinds of compensation that tend to show up here. So this is where, again, this is if you're doing this professionally, there should be a proper exchange here. So when we're looking at our fees and compensation, there are a few different ways that compensation might break down. We have flat fees, we have hourly fees, we have commission or percentage fees, which can be called a few different things, or we can have compensation, or excuse me, combination fees. So it can look a lot of different ways. And even then, this isn't all encompassing. These are just some of the pretty common ways in which we might see it. So let's just break them each down a little bit. So flat fee, what we mean when we're talking about flat fees is really a single rate or sum for which the services are provided. So really, here is the lump sum for the services provided. It can be broken up in various ways. So it may be here is one fee, of $1,000 for the services provided. Or it might be half now, upon, or a very common thing, half upon signing, half upon delivery of whatever product or whatever creative piece or creative output is happening there. Or it might be in stages. Still, when it's that kind of piece, it's still considered a flat fee, that there's just one rate for the work that tends to be happening. And so flat fees are pretty common, especially where there are clearly defined market slash industry standards. That's one of the places where you see that in certain ways. Another is hourly fees. So this flows across the world. I mean, this is, not at all uncommon. So a certain rate per hour, very common across many service industry pieces and certainly within the creative industry. So, how do the hours break down? What is the rate per hour, et cetera? And so that might equal sum total of what's there. It's still in a contract, might show up as a lump sum. Like here is the fee that's going to be paid, but still it might be broken down in an hourly sense. It might be calculated from an hourly standpoint. Another common one is commission or percentage, like really a percentage of the money generated, the profits or revenue generated from this. And so this sometimes is called commission. It oftentimes is really when we're talking about royalties, this is really what we're talking about is some percentage of the money that's flowing is going in a certain direction. And so this idea being that there's a percentage fee. Now, this can look a lot of different ways in agreement. It can really be broken down as like gross receipts or net receipts or like all the money that's coming in or the money that's coming in minus these pieces. So understanding what this breakdown is particularly key depending on what agreement you're looking at. And then also there's a combination. Like seldom is it just one of those pieces. Sometimes it might be some combination. So maybe there's a flat fee, producer. Maybe you're a producer and you get a flat fee up front, but then there's also a percentage on the back end based upon the release and what level this project is happening here. Or maybe there's, different percentage pieces that come through. There's a fee as a director of photography, but then depending on the release and how this is moving through, then there might be points or percentage on the back end. So these are kind of standard things that tend to happen. So some sort of combination piece is not at all uncommon. Or maybe someone does a flat fee, and then it's like, and then if it goes over a certain amount of time, then it tips over into hourly. Again, all pretty common things that can certainly come up. So you see this happen and unfold in those ways when you're looking at, okay, how are these pieces of compensation coming through? So, you might look at this again, you might see this breakdown a couple of different ways as far as how the compensation shows up. In an agreement, it doesn't usually say compensation. Like a lot of times it's fees or something along those lines, but it definitely should have some sort of breakdown where you'll understand how the money is flowing in that regard. And again, what's the payment? What's it going to be? Well, the reality is only you know your true worth. That is one of the joys and challenges of the creative aspect of things is that these can ebb and flow and move. And so I always tell people like you lean into what you know the worth is and you know the value is. That's going to be determined pretty heavily by your values and what leads you in, what takes you in that direction. And so understanding your worth from a creative standpoint, understanding your risk if you're the contracting industry entity or the organization that's doing so, these pieces are going to certainly be key. So we see our fees and our compensation a few different ways. Now, one of the other things I want to make sure to just give you a little bit of breakdown and then also leave a little bit of time for a couple of questions I've seen come through is just what are some of the common contracts that we see come through? At this point, we've talked about, well, what are some of the key terms and provisions that tend to come up? Then we've also talked a bit about, okay, well, what is some of the flow of money that we expect to be happening as we're looking at this? So with those two things in mind, what are some of the common entertainment industry contracts and just some of those things that we do actually see in them? So a few here to take a look at. So the first one is recording agreements in music. So I do a lot of music work, excuse me, This is one of the ones that you see pretty commonly. So a lot of people oftentimes think about like recording agreements, like what does this look like? That's kind of an older thing, but they're still alive and well in a lot of ways. So a basic notion of a recording agreement is just like a legal agreement between like a record label or an entity that's doing things in that regard, and a recording artist, where the act makes an audio recording for the label to sell and promote. Like that's kind of the fundamental notion there. Now, this can break down a few different ways. These do still happen a lot. In fact, they're still much more prominent than some of our maybe modern discourse would lead us to believe. It used to be the way that music got out there, that if you were creating something and then it was time to take that music and exploit it and bring it to the masses in a recorded way, then that was really only going to be happening through being signed to a label. That is not necessarily the case now, but they do still happen, and there's a few things that we see around here. So there's what I would call kind of the full scale recording agreement. That's your typical one where it's all kind of all in, all encompassing around it. Now, there's a lot of things that you can talk about around that and really kind of understand. But one of the key examples that leads back to some of our key terms and provisions is how complicated the term can be in a full scale recording agreement or even a simple one. So we say, how long is this agreement? Well, when we're talking about term, we were saying, well, maybe it's measured in years. It's a year or it's 2 years or something along those lines. Or maybe it's until the services are completed, or something along those lines. A recording agreement is going to be much more complex in that way. You hear and see a lot of language that is oftentimes breaking it up into these project pieces. So again, not always this way, but kind of a standard, older, but and continuously going way as if someone was recording an album. Well, then maybe they're being contracted for multiple albums. So they're signing a recording agreement in which the label essentially agrees to sign them to do multiple albums. But the way that that breaks down is that it might be across different pieces. Here's the initial album. Then the label has what we would call an option to continue forward if it's successful, or not continue, not pick up the option, as we often call it, if it's not successful, and be able to challenge those pieces as it's kind of moving forward. So it's usually heavy as far as the benefit on the label side in that. And so this can last a long time. That's when we talk about or record deals. We say, oh, he was in it for 4 records, or she was in that for about 3 records. Like that could be, a short amount of time, a long amount of time. The time is really measured by a combination of the cycles and the service and the output. So term does not typically show up easily in something along those lines. Similarly, with recording agreements, you might see singles agreements. So maybe the same kind of thing, but just for one song. Much more common these days than it used to be. It's always been around, but especially when, we live in a time where a single piece of music, a single song could have a viral moment, or it can be the thing that around which a gathering is coming. So you might see something that is signed for this particular one song, and then maybe there's more after that. And then you also see pretty commonly distribution agreements, because the ability to make high quality music is more accessible than it used to be. Now there's more commonly distribution agreements. So it used to be that, and again, in order to get music out, that meant that you were signing to a label and they were going to front and take care of all of the cost and ability to create the music, to go to the recording studio, etc. That is still, one of my favorite things, but it's not the only way that it happens. People can create a certain level of high quality music without that requirement from the label. And so distribution agreements basically pick up after the creation of music. They say, you are creating the music. You are responsible for providing us with professional, high quality music. And then now we will activate our apparatus to distribute it, to get it out there. And so that is not at all uncommon these days, both on the kind of entry end, where someone might be able to create a certain amount of music that would work for the genre and kind of the landscape they're doing, and then they might be picked up for a distribution agreement, or on the higher end, where someone has been very successful and they don't need a label to fund their ability to create music. They just need the ability to get it out there, you might see those pieces. So these are some common places where some of our key terms and provisions that we talk about start to get more complex because they're a little bit more tailored in this way. Couple more. So another one in film, the crew deal memo. Like again, this is really just the notion of a type of contract that like film members might sign before a shoot. This highlights a lot of the terms and conditions of the work, the agreement, like the pay, rate of pay, like kind of even the overtime pay, sometimes the meal provision. So it might have a breakdown, a lot of the pieces. Sometimes what follows that is a longer form agreement. Sometimes not necessarily. So sometimes it is the sum total of the agreement that's signed. It's meant to really help us understand what's happening on a production and kind of what's expected there. And one of the things that can come up with these sometimes is just understanding like if a production doesn't move forward or if something happens, is there a kill fee? Is there still money that has to be given out even though the performance was not able to be done there? Also, this is a place where confidentiality, again, in our landscape, can be really high, so not being able to just like take pictures on set and present stuff and post things to social feeds. The confidentiality clause, which shows up in most contracts, a lot of times is going to be rather significant in a crew deal memo, depending on the level and the like the what kind of contract it is, and or excuse me, what kind of project it is. One of the another common and kind of up and coming agreement is your influencer agreement. Really a contract between a business and a social media influencer, outlining really those terms and conditions of that partnership when it comes to it. This is not at all uncommon in that regard because really we live in the land of influence and there are many more ways to do it. And so the key terms and provisions we talked about will show up pretty heavily there, but some of the things that are maybe distinct to an influencer agreement, or at least are given a distinct weight, is first of all, what's the level of autonomy? Is we've probably all scrolled and seen maybe someone we follow who they're doing their thing, but now it's also an ad. You're going, oh, this is like totally in their style, but they're partnering with this person, or is it something where the company or the brand has much more control over how this looks and flows through. So what's the level of autonomy? Also, a lot of times your non-disparagement is going to be really strong here. Basically, the idea that like you can't say something bad about your partner, about the person or company or brand that you've been working with, both now and kind of into the future. You may not have to say great things, but like you can't say bad things in that regard. Again, not at all uncommon, but it's possibly going to be stronger here because the whole idea is that this person is influential. So we don't want them to have a negative influence after just having made money off of something. And then also, what's the ownership of IP? Who's owning these posts? Who's owning like, what does this look like? So, sure, this may be in someone's channel, but they're also utilizing and talking about the IP of a brand partner. So, what's that ownership, license, et cetera, look like? How long does it have to stay up? Can it ever come down, et cetera? Those pieces are going to want to be hammered out pretty solidly here. Last one is a collaborator agreement. This is kind of an all a broad way of just kind of the notion of we are coming together for two creative pieces, pieces of creative collaboration. So a lot of things might fall under this umbrella: a producer agreement, a songwriter agreement, even just split sheets or like a joint venture. So lots of different things where we're basically laying out the terms of ownership and authorship. And that's the key piece. That's what's really important about it, is if multiple people come together to create something, understanding the specifics of who owns what in what percentage and in what weight really needs to be laid out. The default setting, with few exceptions, for the most part, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but you can think of it this way. The default setting when two people come together to create something and then put a new thing out in the world, if there's no clear agreement otherwise, it's typically considered that they are both co-creators, 50-50. We both are, well, really kind of like both 100% owners in this. And so like it doesn't matter who did the most work, et cetera, unless that stuff is laid out, like it's kind of all equal parts. So if you pull together five people to create something, but you were the brainchild behind it, if you don't lay that out clearly, then it's going to be really difficult to show that this should not just go evenly in kind of all senses and power and control and revenue, etc. And so having some sort of collaboration agreement if you're coming together to talk about who owns what and what that breaks down into is particularly key. Again, it helps with the headaches later. And it can feel like a wet blanket, I know, at some point, but I always say that we're doing this so that we can stay focused on the thing that we enjoy most, the thing that is important to us in this regard. And so hammering out some of these pieces early on, even if it's not exciting, can really help us. Now, these are a few, again, that's a lot of stuff, like some of our key provisions, also looking at some of our compensation, looking at some of the standard agreements that might come up, but hopefully that gives a pretty good sense of some of the things that you might be facing. A few final thoughts here, and then, a couple of questions, I'm sure. So, first of all, contracts are meant to help, not hinder. Like they are really the codification, the pulling together of an agreement that we have made. We agree to do something. This is really us, making a record of that. So while we want to do that in a clear way, that's the heart of it. The heart of it is not meant to be distrust. It helps protect against that, but the heart of it is meant to actually really have a record of the trust we have, a record of the excitement that we have to do this. And so, oftentimes, if you're approaching it that way, that can really help. Also, you're not in this alone. There are plenty of us, entertainment attorneys, that are happy to help because this, as you can see, can be specific stuff. But also, there are a couple of organizations that are really meant to help push and support the arts. So Lawyers for the Creative Arts, that's who I'm with, and then also the Alliance Illinois, another organization that is really about helping all creatives have the resources that they need. And so when it comes to trying to navigate these pieces and understand who's in your corner and who can help, then certainly those are some of the places that will definitely help. So you don't have to do this alone. We are all happy to help. Now we have a few more minutes. I've seen a couple of questions that have come through. Yeah, Tim, was there anything that we want
I
to
just
add?
wanted to say thanks so much. This is a wealth of information. This is amazing.
Yes.
Thank you very much for doing this. This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
folks, throw your questions in the Q&A, and yeah, I could lob some to you now if you're ready.
Sure, that's perfectly fine to me.
All right. So the first one we have is at what point should an artist become an LLC instead of an independent contractor?
Sure. So we almost made it all the way through a legal presentation without me saying it depends, but oh, sorry, we hit it depends o'clock, but it does kind of depend. I guess I would say in general, um, when you're the two things that really help you about being an LLC is limiting liability, and then also making sure that money flows properly. And so there's no harm in doing that kind of immediately. But if there's multiple people involved, then a lot of times it's really helpful to just from the get-go have an LLC. If it's just you yourself, still having an LLC can be helpful if you're going to have money flowing, because as soon as you have an LLC or just a legal entity, then you can have business accounts and make sure that your funds are not what we like to call commingled, and that's really, really key because the IRS does not like that. And so I really say, like, typically, once you have money flowing through, it's good to just separate it early on. And so you want to be able to have business accounts, and then also if there's multiple people involved from the get-go, and or if you are concerned about like liability, you just want to make sure that everything's underneath the umbrella of the business. It's good to do that. So earlier than later tends to be a good way to go, especially if you happen to be doing it in Illinois. It's not particularly complicated.
That's great. The next one is will we have access to your legal agreement example? I know folks resort to ChatGPT as it has become a cost effective legal cost. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so probably because this particular one, I pulled some pieces out of it, but I haven't sanitized the whole thing. So not necessarily have that one there, but I can. There are some great places to find things. So, for instance, Lawyer for the Creative Arts has an excellent library of lots of form agreements that are not chat GPT, if you will. And so I certainly recommend checking there because there's a great amount across multiple places of some of my stuff, is there or from there. And then, yeah, ChatGPT, I'm just not one of those people who necessarily is going to like crash on tools as they come into the world. I think that's one of the things that like we have to wrestle with is what does it mean to understand new landscapes? And we in the creative industries are often at the forefront of that. However, I guess the thing I'd tell you is that like in the legal realm, it's generally a problem if we use Chat GPT as like a final piece because it's just not necessarily particularly legally sound. So I always say it might get you started in the right direction. It might give you some really great ideas, but don't let it be the end all be all because it's not there yet. Like it's not particularly legally reliable. And just quite frankly, like I can usually see if something comes to go, oh, I can tell that this was done there and I can see where some of the holes are. But it can at least get you started with what you're looking for.
That's great. Who should send the first agreement? As a singer, should I contract the accompanist or should they send an agreement to me?
Yeah, it's a great question. Another bit of like it depends. I'd say maybe there's not a hard rule on like who should do it first. Honestly, I say it kind of flows along relationship and kind of connection lines. Me, generally, my fundamental, as you've seen, kind of fundamental perspective is that getting this out in the open early and talking about how we're going to do things can actually help the process move along in an effective way. So that tends to be a great way to like do it and kind of move things along. So I want to lead that. I don't necessarily want to wait for someone else to do so. If you feel confident doing so, doing that with some of that caveat, if it's kind of a concern, is really helpful. On the other hand, I also find that it is kind of negotiation and leverage. So, it's not necessarily that the first person who does it gets the best position, but it does help. You're not just necessarily responding or reacting to things. So if you feel like you want to lay things out or you kind of want to push those along, then doing that early first, or even asking first, even if you're like, look, I'm not the person who can put this together, but I want to see something. Can you send me something? I say lean toward the initiation more than just waiting to see if something will happen because you might be waiting a while or it might be, headaches if you wait too long.
That's a great point. The next one is I signed a general release as a model for a photo shoot where my photo is attached to a specific product. Can the company license the product to appear in TV film with my face clearly visible without my consent? Can they put my face on other products not listed in the general release?
It definitely depends on what is laid out in there. So I'd say in general, for the most part, a couple of things that's going to depend on is like the state and the jurisdiction, et cetera. But in general, not really. Without some kind of clear sense of like, yes, you have given up these full rights for these pieces. So if they've narrowly said that this is how we're using your photo for this specific product and just for that, they can't just automatically turn that into other things that they're using it for. The reality, though, is looking closely at going, well, is this what's in the agreement? Does it give them the ability to do some more things? Does it have, kind of some broad language that might let them have more openings? Possibly. But generally speaking, they can't necessarily automatically do that based upon that one piece. Just because I have one photo and it's attached to one product, I can't go, oh, and I'm also going to use it here and here and here. That's not necessarily an automatic right that they tend to have. So you can hear a lot of like hedging in there, but nevertheless, it does just kind of depend on what's in the agreement.
Yeah, that sounds like a really particular situation where, yeah, I'd encourage to get in touch with Odell or the Lawyers for Creative Arts and find a exact answer to that
Yes.
question. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, we have hit our time. Odell, this is amazing. Thank you so much for all of this information.
Of course. Yes. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. You all are really, really great. I'm excited about everything happening this week. And by all means, if there's anything you need, let us know.
And Ear Taxi Festival, like I said, is continuing. So be sure to get your tickets for the rest of the events, and we'll see you there. Thanks, everybody, so much for being here. Thank you, Odell, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everybody.